Mr. Edwin Sarmiento is here. How's it going, sir? From
That's why he was late.
His microphone's not.
No, my MacBook is screwing me up. Every once in a while it crashes. I don't know. Maybe I need to upgrade.
Every once.
Oh, Apple crash? I don't. What?
Shh. You didn't hear that from me.
That's why
dude, he's in the place where Johnny Ives lives. You're in Johnny Ives' house, aren't you?
He's actually inside his toilet right now.
That is funny. The quality of the backgrounds between us is like all over the place. We do all kinds of wild different stuff. So Edwin, you should, an audience, Edwin's in here this week to do a guest instructor kind of Q&A. He'll answer any kind of high availability, disaster recovery questions, whatever. Edwin, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
What do I do? Oh, I pretended I know high availability. No, I've been doing high availability for almost 10 years now. I started off as a data center engineer for one of those big Japanese companies that none of you know of. And my background is more of a data center guy, building data centers, managing. And I specialize in SQL Server failover clustered instances, availability groups, anything high availability.
Nice. And so where are you originally from?
Okay. So,
I have that same feeling.
I'm originally from the Philippines. The reason that caught me off guard was just this past weekend we're working on our Canadian citizenship, and it's been quite a while. We are almost 10 years now in Canada. We moved here back in 2008. So
I was going to say, as long as I've known you, yeah, you were up in Canada. What's the Canadian citizenship process like? Like, what kind of work is involved?
To be perfectly honest, I don't know. It kept changing. So ever since I've been here, things kept changing. I mean, back then it was you got to be a Canadian permanent resident in order for you to apply. Well, for at least 4 years out of 5 in order for you to apply. They changed that back in 2013 to 4 out of 5. Now it's back to 3 out of 5. It's, you know, sometimes we joke around the fact that, hey, maybe we should start a Canadian immigration agency and maybe leave our IT jobs and just do that for a living.
Yeah, demystify it. Jeez.
Yep. Very complicated process.
Let's see. So we might as well go ahead and get into the technical questions. We'll start with Richard has an interesting one. He says, what's the easiest and fastest way to migrate from on-premises SQL Server up to Amazon's RDS with as small cutover window as possible? He says, availability groups isn't supported. Log backups aren't available to us, being deduped and vaulted by third-party software. Is there anything that I can do other than transactional replication? Wow, I don't think he has any options.
And somebody said transactional replication. Like, ew.
Yeah, I don't think you have an option there. That is pretty rough because RDS is like a sealed box for you get database mirroring, but that's only inside of RDS. You don't get to mirror into it, so that's tough.
And there are capabilities that only exist in RDS. Like, for instance, somebody was asking about doing backups, like native SQL Server backups within RDS. There are stored procedures that only exist in RDS, but they're not in the native SQL Server on-premises version.
So, let's see. Next up, Brian says, Edwin, do you have a punch list to speak of all the failure scenarios that you test with always on? And he doesn't say failover clusters or availability groups, but he says, if you could tell me what'll break, it'll make it easier to deal with when it does.
What's really interesting is somebody on a Microsoft forum asked the same question, like, what would cause an automatic failover? Which is kind of interesting because there are so many things, and which was also followed up by, I'm not really concerned about what would make failover clustering cause an automatic failover. And the gist of it is availability groups and failover clustered instances. I mean, if you're looking at high availability, they still run on top of Windows Server failover cluster. So whatever applies to failover clustering applies to always on availability groups and failover clustered instances. But there's just so many of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
there's not 3. Yeah. When we all attended the PASS conference in 2016, one of the sessions I went to was availability group monitoring. Yeah, I'd been supporting availability groups for 3 years by the time I went there, but it was interesting. It was by Microsoft, and they had condensed it down to an hour, but I think they said it was more like a 4-hour topic. That's just how much monitoring is really needed. What are the failures that can happen? And I don't remember what I learned, honestly, but it was a good session.
Not much in an hour.
Great session. Great session.
Sometimes it's too good just to be scared. Another Brian, different Brian follows up with, he says, how would you configure quorum settings when I have 6 nodes and I've got 3 nodes in one region and 3 nodes in another region? The 3 in the primary, I guess, are sync, and the 3 in the other region are async replicas.
It's interesting when somebody say, how do you? Because I don't know, because I don't know what your business requirements are. And it's interesting whenever I tell customers that, they're kind of like, no, I only want an answer. But the reality is, what is your ultimate objective? What's your recovery objective? What's your service level agreement? Because telling me that you've got like 3 nodes in one data center, another 3 nodes in another data center does not tell me anything about, what your recovery objectives are and what your service level agreements are. Now, let's assume that you don't want automatic failover between data centers. If you don't want automatic failover within data centers, you've got even number of nodes, 3 in maybe one data center and 3 on another data center. You want a tiebreaker. So you got node majority, you got file share, you got disk witness, you got cloud witness in Windows Server 2016. What would you want to use? I'm a pragmatic person. I'm very practical. I'll just use file share witness and host it in the data center that I'm trying to protect. Mainly because, well, you don't want to be spending so much on an extra vote within the cluster. So there's, again, you always need to go back to why would you want to do that?
So let's see, next up we have Tammy asks, we have a third-party app that's shrinking a database every hour. Then off to a good start. Then our monitoring application alerts about log space problems for that database. I grow the files, but they were promptly shrunk again in the next hour. How would you handle this situation?
I mean, if you're stuck with this application and you can't make them change it, then I just wouldn't be. I wouldn't be doing the manual growth. So you let it auto grow and then you shrink back down, I guess. But also maybe modify your monitoring application so it doesn't alert to this guy. I mean, most monitoring applications allow you to do custom alerts or to change the rule.
That's rough.
It was bad.
I would be hating life though, yeah, with having to support that third-party application. I bet you it uses the SA account and does all sorts of bad stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like, is there any justification from the app provider about why they do that, or like, is there any talking to them, or is it just completely gone and you're just stuck supporting it?
I would bet that this is a legacy application. It's been around
right?
for a long time, and doing things back then. I mean, it wasn't ever recommended to do this in SQL Server 2000, but it was probably more common to do this type of thing in older versions.
Depending on the command that it runs, what I might do is I might add a second log file, cap the size of the the first log file really small so it never tries to shrink it, and then just let the other file grow and do whatever it needs to do. Because then if it's just trying to shrink this one thing, if it does anything, then there's nothing in there to shrink. Make it like a meg. What's it going to do? To have a second log file. Because I'm willing to bet the way it's calling, it's not like shrink database. I'm willing to bet it's doing shrink file, and it's targeting whatever that default log file is. Yeah. I bet if you added a second log file and just let that thing do whatever it wanted to do, you'd be fine. That's what I'd screw those guys. Jerk.
That's so much better than my bad answer. My bad answer was going to be, if you know what time it happens, you could set up a log on trigger so that whenever they go to log on, the app goes to log on at that time. It would fail.
That was my idea. Yeah.
Chase says, I want to know what Edwin or Brent and chatting about. No, we both have the same bad ideas about exactly what we would want to do. Anna says, for when clusterless, Anna, rephrase your question. She's asking basically how many secondaries can be supported and how many secondaries can be on Linux, but she says something about clusterless in there. I'm like, let's be nice to it.
Well, I'm guessing because, it's on Linux, people think it doesn't have a cluster. Well, in SQL Server 2017, you got the clusterless option, which just basically means there is no high availability solution. So even on Windows, you could do that.
Let's see. Next up, Pablo asks, what would the advice be between either rebuilding indexes or dropping them and recreating them? Which one should I do?
Neither.
And why?
Leave it alone. Well, I mean, look, dropping and recreating an index is a hell of a gig, right? Because you have all the pain of the rebuild, because you have to drop the index, which means you got to take out the locks to drop it, and then after it's dropped, people can get in there and do crap, and they can just do indexless things, do things without an index, which is awful for them. It's awful for end users. At least if you just rebuild the index, if it's online, users can get in and do stuff during that time anyway. It doesn't really buy you anything to drop and recreate or rebuild. It's actually kind of worse, because then you're dealing with the drop, which is offline, and taking the locks, and the create, which, if that's not online, then you're doing that, and then people are in there doing things without a supporting index. But Brent has a great session at Group Buy. Great session, Brent. So what is it? Why defragmenting index isn't happening, or why isn't helping, or why rebuilding index isn't helping? Right. So I would go watch that and make sure that you're rebuilding indexes for the right reasons. That, like, you're not just doing it at like 5%, 30% because someone told you to do that 15 years ago. Make sure that you're targeting indexes that it's sensible to do that for. No one, when people tell DBAs to rebuild or reorg at certain levels, no one ever tells them, hey, if it takes you 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours to do index maintenance, are you actually saving that much time when your queries run? Are you saving 2, 4, 6, 8 hours of query runtime by doing this? Are you saving all the resources that you expend CPU, I/O, memory-wise when your queries run that you're expending when you do these rebuilds and reorgs and stuff? Make sure that you're actually getting something out of them, aside from the fact, like pointing, saying, no, look, they're not fragmented. It's not really going to help you.
And you're also going to look at, what else is in that database. I mean, I had a customer ask a question about, hey, we're thinking about defragmenting or rebuilding indexes, but it's on an availability group. I mean, that impacted the performance as they're doing their index rebuild and defrag. And look, I can't really help you that much unless you provide me additional. I know I'm trying to segue into providing additional information, but how many indexes are there? How long does it take for you to defrag versus rebuild? And what's the overall impact on the performance when client applications are connecting to the primary? So you have to think about the other things that come into the picture when you're trying to do a simple, well, you might be thinking it's just a simple rebuild or drop in rebuild or defrag, but there are other implications on the database.
And I've had to completely disable index maintenance on an availability group, even switching. So it was 2 or 3 asynchronous replicas, 1 synchronous replica, and even switching that sync replica to async, I still was having issues. Besides the latency, lots of blocking. It was a very high performance environment, and a lot of batch requests per second. You have 5 to 10,000 at normal times, higher at peak times, and so a lot of people have had to completely disable index maintenance. And is it really needed, as Eric was saying? Still kept my update stats job, once or twice a day. Mm-hmm. That's where the performance benefits of the index maintenance is typically, because you get update statistics with an index rebuild.
Daryl asks, how many of my instances may I enroll in ConstantCare? Right now, it's unlimited. I could see in the future doing something like 100 instance cap, but throw all you want in there. Anon asks, can you pause log shipping? My company does a weird thing where they take a new server back for a day or 2 before they do a final turnover, so any databases would be out of date. We're using simple recovery.
You can't use simple recovery model with log shipping. Log shipping to shipping transaction logs. So you'd have to switch over to bulk log or full recovery model in the first place. You can pause it. You just have the log backups running and not deleting them, and then once 1 or 2 days later, the copies will just proceed in the restores. It might take a while to get up to date, depending upon how much work it has to do, and do you have to start over with a restore restore database and then apply the log chain. It also depends on how much disk space you're able to to keep online. So I've got some clients who only keep 24 hours of backups on disk, and then maybe some other longer term storage. But make sure you have the disk space to be able to have all the transaction log backups that you need to get it back up to date. Yeah,
that's probably why he said the company's doing weird things.
Yes.
Let's see here. Phil asks an odd one. He says, Microsoft moved SSMS into a separate standalone product. Rumors are afoot that it's about to be licensed separately. Has anybody heard anything? Dude, where did you hear those rumors from?
Maybe, I mean, SQL Operations Studio is licensed differently than SQL Server Management Studio.
In that
Or
it's a
will be,
different
so-
license, but they're both
Right.
free.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. Anna asks, Edwin, do you recommend using Service Broker with Always On?
It's an interesting question because, when people ask me, do you recommend, the first question I ask is it supported? Now, if it is supported, then I would recommend it based on, of course, your workload. A common question, aside from Service Brokers, DTC. Would you recommend DTC with availability groups? And of course, unless it is fully supported, it's not something that I would recommend. Quote unquote, working does not mean supported. So I can't remember exactly what the support matrix is for Service Broker for 2016. By the way, what version are you using? So I know it does work, but there's some limitations on what is supported, what isn't supported.
All right, let's see. Next up we have Dawn says, updating stats caused my cross-database query to hang. Why?
We would need more
I'll
information.
rephrase it as, can updating stats block stuff?
Yes, a little bit. That Statman query can block stuff, but I'm curious if she means like, or I'm sorry, I didn't see how Don was spelled. I don't know if it's D-O-N or D-A-W-N. So whatever you are, however you identify Don, it would be. I'm curious to know if you mean like the update stats blocked the query, or like you ran update stats and then the next time the query ran, it took a while.
True. Yeah.
Perfect. Let's see. Next up, Turge, I believe it is, says, how high can VLF counts go before it starts causing problems, and what kind of problems will you experience when it starts getting high?
Here's what I know. 75,000 VLFs is not a good thing. Back in around, well, this was SQL Server 2005 days, but around year 2007, 2008, the company I worked for did Microsoft security patching every single month, did reboots. We had high performance systems, failover cluster instances. And I had lots of servers to patch of SQL servers, and patch the other guys. And, so I would be restart on the box after the patches were applied, and I would verify in Management Studio that the instance would come online after it came, it finished the reboot. But I wouldn't expand the databases tree in Object Explorer. And so I moved on to the next server. And a few minutes later, the app admin team said, hey, we can't connect to the database. I don't think it's online. And so I expanded the databases tree in Object Explorer, and boom, it said in recovery for this database that had 5 nines of availability requirements. We were in a maintenance window, so it didn't, but it was bad. And it had been probably 15, 20 minutes since I did the reboot when I would start looking into this. And this is not normal. So I opened up the SQL Server error log, and it's, phase 1 of 3, and I forget what the percentage was, but I was like, oh my goodness, what is going on here? So I didn't know about the VLFs at the time. And luckily this database came online, completed crash recovery after 45 minutes. And this was on a Saturday, I believe. And so my plan was to contact Microsoft. I was going to contact Microsoft that night, but it came online before I could even make that call, because it could take like an hour even for a sit to get someone on the call. So Monday morning, I contacted Microsoft, and they said, hey, run ddcc log_info on it. And, it returned 75,000 rows. He said, this is a virtual log file issue. You have too many log files. And so that's when I learned about VLFs, and 75,000 of them is not a good thing. So it impacts crash recovery time of the database. It impacts your restores too, and in some cases it can impact performance. So I can't tell you what number to target, but so if you have, like, say, a 300 gigabyte log file, you could have less than 1,000 VLFs. I know that just because I fix log files to reduce the number of VLFs. Just need to make sure they're not too big and not too small, and your auto growth setting is correct. Don't use a percentage or a very small number.
At least
I had the opposite. I had the flip side of that coin from Tara. I had I forget how big the log file was, but there were like very few VLFs, but they were all gigantic. And so that took me 24 hours to recover from, because it was like it's reading through like hundreds of gigs for each one. I was like, wow. Oh, come on.
Brian asks, I would like to know the nuts and bolts of how this works. So what's the best document or video that would give me the best deep dive into how Always On actually works internally?
That is a very interesting question. No documentation from Microsoft would actually explain the nuts and bolts. It's just, so here's the thing, and I'm pretty sure you would agree with me in this. They're all over. Like, read one documentation, explains one thing. Read another documentation, explains one thing. It's just all over. And I know this sounds like a bit of a plug. I simplify that in the training class that I'm doing for Brent, where it's all visual. You would see how everything works under the covers, how the transaction log records or log blocks are getting replicated from the primary to secondary, what the weight stats are, what the weight types are, everything simplified. Now, I know that's kind of a rounded up version of it, but here's the deal. It's really complicated if you just simply look at the documentation. I'm trying to simplify as much as I can from some of the articles and the blog posts that I write.
And I'd also say there's no money in Microsoft building that documentation for the public. Like they just don't have an incentive to dedicate human beings to do that because it would take months for them to do it across all kinds of languages. Anything Microsoft does, they want it to be perfect across all these different, standards and all this. And why? When it, half the time it changes every version, they're like, sorry, we need those time for documentation for developers.
And and just attend Edwin's training class on availability groups. Yeah. That gives you a really deep dive into the product.
What's really interesting is I see this across all software vendors. I was just looking at some of the documentation for Microsoft PowerShell for AWS. Same thing. They're all over. I think it's just a thing with software companies. They just are not really good at writing documentation.
Richie is so bored. He's like, I'm done with this.
I just kicked some stuff off. I'm looking at ConstantCare files coming in. And y'all keep going because some people enjoy this stuff, but this isn't.
He's hoping for one of his cats to arrive so he can play with it.
It's hit or miss. Last week or the other week when it was just me and Richie, there were like 70 questions about Git, and I was like, sweet. Oh. I was like, I'm going to take a nap over here. I'm just going to sit.
Gordon asks, what's a good way to measure how much transaction log usage we're doing over time? Like how much of our transaction log we're generating or backing up?
I do have a blog post on that, but I don't recommend that you do it in production. So basically, yes.
That's our favorite kind of answer.
So the blog post that I wrote about, I can't remember exactly what the blog post was all about, but basically the gist of it with sample scripts is you take your log backups and read your log backups using DBCC.
FNDB log?
FNDB log. And part of that is what I did was I came up with an Excel spreadsheet that would tally your transaction log generation throughout, a month, a week. But again, don't do it on production. Do it. Read your log backups, and again, dump that results into a table and come up with an analytical graph on the amount of transaction log records generated over time. But this is not just your inserts, updates, and deletes. That also includes your index maintenance. It generates a lot of transaction log records, so that would factor into that graph. So you might want to pick and choose like your inserts, updates, and delete statements as part of the analysis.
Okay. So let's see. Next up we have Michael says, Tara, if you do have a database with a high number of VLFs, how do you eliminate them and how do you prevent them from returning?
All right, it's easy, and once fixed, it should never come back for that specific database. So you shrink it as far down as you can, say 1 megabyte or 5 megabytes, a really, really small number. You may need to do some transaction log backups as you're doing those shrinks. Do this in the maintenance window, but I've certainly done this during the day on very high critical databases just because I don't want to take a maintenance window for this task. So shrink it all the way down, and then you're going to grow it back out to that original size. Don't just grow it back out part of the way or let it auto grow from there. Grow it back out so that's, because that's the space that it needed before you started doing this task. So, and don't grow it out all in one, otherwise you'll end up with the issue Eric had, and don't grow it out in small chunks because you'll end up with too many VLFs. So if I had, say, my original file is 100 gigabytes, I might just grow it out in, say, 4,000 megabyte chunks. And I don't ever do the 4 gigabyte chunks because I ran into a bug back on SQL Server 2005, and it was horrific. It's been fixed, so on newer versions you wouldn't run into it, but to this day, I will not do increments of 4 gigabytes. So 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes. I'll do 4,000 megabytes or 8,000 megabytes. I will not do the 4 gigabyte incrementer. And then just keep growing it out until you reach the original file size. And don't forget to change your auto growth setting. So on a 100 gigabyte log file, I'll probably do a 1 gigabyte auto growth, maybe 512 megabytes. You don't want it too small and you don't want it too big. But fixing the auto growth is how you prevent it from coming back, this issue from coming back.
I can't remember what version of SQL Server has that alert where if you reach 10,000 DLFs, I think, or 1,000 DLFs, it will write an error, write an error log, SQL Server error log.
Mm-hmm. I want to say that's pretty recent.
Okay, I was going to say, it definitely wasn't there in SQL Server 2005. I would have noticed it. I was a good DBA.
You got a job here and everything went down.
Now she spends all her time painting mountains on the background. It's, illustrating things.
Back there.
Marcy says, one other thing to add, when you do Tara's fix there too, also do a checkpoint before you go and do this stuff too.
Yes.
Gordon's, no, I answered Gordon's one already. Pablo says he's on 2012 always on availability groups. Oh, Tara's showing off her, go show off your mountains. Show off the mountains there.
It's hard to see though. So it goes all the way to the top and it goes all the way down. It's a gradient of grayish blues.
It's pretty awesome. And we've followed this project.
Retrain my brain.
I see a gorilla coming back from out of there in the mist. No.
It's a unicorn.
It's a unicorn.
Yes.
Pablo is on 2012 always on availability groups, and he says, what are the general steps to migrate towards 2017?
So general steps will depend on your maintenance window. You could do a kind of a rolling upgrade scenario where you're adding another replica in your availability group that is running a higher version, say you're in 2012, maybe 2017, and then do failover. But that's a one-way street, which is why you really need to do a lot of testing prior to doing that, because once you've failed over to 2017, you can go back to any of the lower versions. Now, that being said, that's the fastest way to do it. You can do a lot of different things because, number one, if you're on 2012, I'm guessing you're still on Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012 R2 at most. I'm guessing you also want to upgrade your operating system. So you really have to plan well, because you don't want to be upgrading to SQL Server 2017 and then a couple of months later you're upgrading your operating system to the higher version. So if I were you, wait until the whole process of upgrading your hardware and your OS is part of the plan, so that way you don't have to repeat everything. Of course, as a consultant, I would rather, have everything done again because I get paid twice, but I'm not like that. I would rather do it once. I'm lazy. I'd rather do it once, plan accordingly. You're saving your company a lot of time, a lot of resource, and a lot of money.
Well, next up is Chase, who asks, I'm getting a lot of alerts regarding SSPI handshake failed. I could just tweak my monitoring system to ignore it, but should I worry about this?
That is an error message I automatically dismiss. Yes, and it can be fixed, right, with SPNs. I think that this is an SPN issue, right?
Yeah, just do set SPN or allow whatever delegation in the directory account.
But you also have to think about why is something causing that. And when I was doing operational DB, I usually ignore that. But then at one point, I came to realize if it's throwing something like that, most of the time we think it's just Active Directory or it could be an SPN thing. But it could be worse. And I was in a troubleshooting call with Microsoft a couple of years ago where I'm seeing a lot of these incidents. Turns out that the reason why it's getting a lot of that events was the fact that SQL Server could not contact Active Directory. And of course, I kind of passed the ball to the Active Directory guys without realizing that the domain controller was actually sitting on a VM with a single virtual NIC. I know you kind of know where I'm going with this. And every single machine on the network is hitting that thing. So it's not just SQL Server that's getting affected. It's everything on the network. And so I told them, look, maybe it's about time that you move this VM to a physical machine because everything's hitting the same VM.
Landon asks, a question for Richie. He says, is ConstantCare using a secure file transfer method to upload the data to AWS?
Carrier pigeons.
Bit by bit.
One bit at a time. Yeah,
yes, we are, and it's because Brent made me. I think in initial testing, we were just going to use HTTPS and be done with it. And then Brent made me throw some encryption on it, kind of the, Salt Bay encryption type thing. And we are now fully encrypted, everything up to the cloud. And once it gets to the cloud, we decrypt and we process the files.
Yeah, there we go. So let's see. The last one we'll take is Saket. Saket asks, how can we automate SQL patching in an availability group when SSISDB is in there as well?
Not supposed to be in there, right? That guy's not supported on an availability group, I don't think.
So when this thing first came out, because SSISDB was introduced in SQL Server 2012, there were a lot of challenges because, for one, you wouldn't want SSISDB to be in there unless you know for a fact that you're going to put all your SSIS packages in there instead of MSDB or, maybe file share for SSIS. But it became a bit more challenging because every single database has to be in the availability group, and you're putting SSISDB in the availability group. Come patching time, it just screws things up. You would have to remove the SSISDB from the availability group, patch the nodes, and then add it all back, which was why he asked that question. Now, you can automate that process either through a combination of PowerShell and T-SQL. It all depends on what your patch management processes are. Are you using System Center for your patch management process? Are you using group policies for it? It becomes a bit more challenging, but you can use a combination of PowerShell plus T-SQL to remove the database, patch the node, and add the database back into the availability group.
It sounds like a lot of work. I mean, it's not supported, right? I mean, why put it in the availability group if it's not supported?
That I would have to ask the product team for further clarification.
At my last job, we had availability groups and we had SSIS packages, and we were very excited about SSISDB and all of its features. And so we had our availability groups for the user databases, non-Microsoft stuff, and then we had a separate virtual machine that had SSISDB that was not in an availability group, and that had it had other. We did snapshots on that guy like every 5 minutes, so it still had some HA features in place. It just wasn't an availability group.
All right. Well, that's everything we've got time for this week. Thanks, Edwin, for coming out.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Questions, absolutely awesome. Do you want to say a few words about who the right person is to come to your courses coming up on failover clusters and availability groups?
Well, it's interesting because I'm also looking at the trends. First one we did last September, there were more senior DBAs who attended. The one we did last December, there were IT managers, which is very interesting. IT managers and sysadmins who are getting started with SQL Server. And so if you're a senior DBA, or even if you're a sysadmin or systems engineer who are now responsible for managing SQL Server, particularly availability groups, or if you're an IT manager who just needs to understand this, or maybe you're an IT manager who needs to fill in because you're still waiting for a new senior DBA to be hired, this is the right course for you, because I try to simplify, like I said, I try to simplify everything that involves always on availability groups. And the new one that we came up with is the failover clustered instances, because they're not dead. They're still out there in the field, and I'm pretty sure that you still need to manage them until you decide to move to availability groups or even to the cloud.
Well, perfect. Thank you, sir. Look forward to the class, and see everybody next week in office hours. Adios, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.